The small town of Willow Creek had always felt like a prison to Emily Parker. Its narrow streets, lined with peeling paint and whispers of past glory, were steeped in memories she had tried to leave behind. But when the call came that her estranged father, Richard Parker, had passed away unexpectedly, she had no choice but to return. Emily sat at the back of the church during the funeral, her black dress stiff and uncomfortable. She kept her gaze low, avoiding the glances of distant relatives who looked at her like a curiosity. Her father's casket, polished oak and draped in white roses, stood at the front, a stark reminder of the man she barely knew anymore. Beside the casket stood Julia, Richard's second wife, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Her grief seemed genuine, but Emily couldn't help but feel the familiar sting of resentment. Julia had swooped into their lives when Emily was just a teenager, the glamorous woman who took her father's attention and affection. Ryan, her 24-year-old half-brother, stood quietly next to Julia. His head was bowed, hands clasped tightly together. Unlike Emily, Ryan had stayed close to their father until the end, taking on the role of dutiful son, the perfect son. After the service, Emily lingered on the church steps as mourners filtered out, murmuring their condolences. She didn't want to follow everyone to the house for the reception, but she knew it was expected. Before she could make her escape, Ryan approached her. "You came," he said, his voice low but not unkind. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" Emily replied, avoiding his eyes. Ryan hesitated, then said, "Look, I know things weren't great between you and Dad, but he wanted you here. He talked about you more than you think." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" Ryan didn't answer, and the silence stretched between them until Julia joined them, her sharp heels clicking against the stone steps. "Emily, we're heading back to the house. I hope you'll join us," she said with a tight smile, as though issuing a challenge. "Of course," Emily replied, matching Julia's tone. She didn't come all this way to back down now. The Parker house was as imposing as ever, a Victorian relic perched at the edge of town. Emily had spent her childhood here, roaming its creaky halls, but now it felt foreign. She drifted through the reception like a ghost, avoiding Julia's pointed stares and Ryan's attempts at conversation. Near the end of the evening, Richard's lawyer, Mr. Garrett, arrived. His presence immediately caught everyone's attention, and the room quieted as he cleared his throat. "I apologize for interrupting," he began, "but I wanted to let the family know that the reading of Mr. Parker's will is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I'll need all immediate family members present." Julia's eyes flicked to Emily, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something. Concern? Suspicion? She couldn't tell. Ryan, standing behind Julia, looked equally tense. "Will there be any surprises?" Julia asked with a forced laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. Mr. Garrett smiled politely. "I'm afraid I can't say, Mrs. Parker. All will be revealed tomorrow." Emily stayed quiet, but a nagging feeling tugged at her. The atmosphere in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, as though everyone was holding their breath. The next morning, as Emily entered Mr. Garrett's office with Julia and Ryan, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The lawyer greeted them with a somber expression, gesturing for them to sit. "Thank you all for coming," he began, unfolding a stack of papers on his desk. "I regret to inform you that the original copy of Mr. Parker's will is missing." Julia gasped. Ryan stiffened in his chair. Emily's heart sank. "What do you mean, missing?" Julia demanded, her voice rising. Mr. Garrett sighed. "I have an unsigned draft that outlines Mr. Parker's wishes, but the official, signed document is nowhere to be found. I've already initiated an investigation, but for now, we're in a very uncertain situation." Emily glanced at Ryan, who was staring at the table, his jaw tight. Julia, on the other hand, looked furious. "This is ridiculous. Richard was meticulous about these things. Someone must have taken it." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Emily's unease deepened. Whoever had the will held more than just the family's inheritance. They held the power to expose secrets that might change everything. The drive back to the Parker house was tense. Julia sat in the passenger seat of Ryan's car, her lips pursed tightly, while Emily stared out the window from the back seat, trying to piece together what had just happened. Someone must have taken it, Julia said again, breaking the silence. The will doesn't just disappear. Ryan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It doesn't make sense. Dad would have kept it in the safe, like always. That's assuming he trusted everyone with the combination, Julia shot back, her sharp tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Emily leaned forward. What are you trying to say, Julia? That one of us took it. Julia turned in her seat, her eyes narrowing. I'm saying this doesn't feel random. Someone had a reason to make it disappear. Emily rolled her eyes and leaned back. Don't be dramatic. If you're so worried, why don't we check the house? Maybe it's still there somewhere. Julia hesitated, then nodded. Fine. Let's start with his office when we get back. The Parker house was eerily quiet when they arrived. Ryan led the way to Richard's office, a dimly lit room filled with shelves of dusty books and a large oak desk. Julia immediately started rifling through drawers, her movements frantic, while Emily watched from the doorway, arms crossed. This is ridiculous, Emily said after a few minutes. Do you really think Dad would have left his will lying around? It's not ridiculous, Julia snapped, pulling open the desk's bottom drawer. Your father was careless with plenty of things, Emily. This might have been one of them. Ryan stood by the bookshelf, his face pale. It's not here. I've looked through everything in this room since Dad passed. If it was here, it's gone now. Emily studied him. There was something in his voice. Guilt? Anxiety? She couldn't tell. Julia sighed in frustration, slamming a drawer shut. Who else had access to this room? Plenty of people, Emily said. You, Ryan, Dad's assistant, the housekeeper. Julia turned on her. You were here the night he died, weren't you? Maybe you saw something. Emily's jaw tightened. I hadn't been in this house in years before the funeral. Don't even try to pin this on me. The tension in the room was suffocating. Ryan finally stepped between them, his voice low but firm. Enough. Fighting isn't going to solve anything. Let's just wait for the lawyer to figure it out. Julia huffed but said nothing more, retreating to her bedroom. Emily lingered in the office for a moment, her gaze falling on her father's desk. Something felt off. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The weight of the missing will and Julia's accusations gnawed at her. She decided to search the house herself, starting in the attic where her father kept old records. The attic was a labyrinth of boxes and forgotten relics. Emily sifted through paperwork, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she pulled open a file marked Personal, a folded piece of paper slipped out. Her breath caught. It was a letter addressed to Julia. Emily hesitated, then opened it, her heart racing. Julia, if you're reading this, it means I've finally done what I should have years ago. I know you think I owe you everything, but you've taken more from me than I could ever repay. I can't let you continue to manipulate this family. I hope this will finally end the hold you have over me and over them. The letter ended abruptly, as though her father had stopped mid-thought. Emily stared at the paper, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. What had Julia taken from him? What was the hold she had over their family? Before she could process it, a floorboard creaked behind her. Emily spun around, clutching the letter. Ryan stood at the top of the attic stairs, his face unreadable. What are you doing up here? He asked quietly. Emily hesitated, looking for answers. Ryan stepped closer, his expression hardening as he noticed the paper in her hand. What's that? Something Dad wrote, she said cautiously. Ryan's jaw tightened. You shouldn't be digging into things you don't understand, Emily. She narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're not the only one who's looking for answers, Ryan said, his voice low. And if you're not careful, you might not like what you find. Emily didn't sleep that night. Ryan's words echoed in her mind, cryptic, almost threatening. The letter she'd found burned a hole in her pocket, but she wasn't ready to confront Julia about it yet. Instead, she decided to take a different approach. The next morning, Emily visited Mr. Garrett's office alone. The lawyer looked surprised to see her, but motioned for her to sit. I didn't expect to see you today, Miss Parker, he said, adjusting his glasses. Is everything all right? No, it's not, Emily replied. She placed the letter on his desk. I found this in my father's things. It doesn't explain the missing will, but it raises questions. Questions about Julia. Mr. Garrett picked up the letter, reading it with a furrowed brow. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. This complicates things. What does it mean? Emily asked. The lawyer hesitated, then said, Your father confided in me on several occasions about his concerns regarding Julia. He suspected she wasn't entirely honest about her past, financial dealings, her first marriage, even her motives for marrying him. But he never provided concrete proof. Emily's stomach churned. And now the will is gone. Do you think Julia had something to do with it? Mr. Garrett sighed. It's possible, but without evidence, it's just speculation. The draft I have indicates your father intended to split the estate equally between you, Ryan, and Julia. If Julia believed she was being cut out, she might have had a motive to intervene. Emily nodded, her suspicions hardening into resolve. If there's anything else you know, anything that could help, I need to hear it. Mr. Garrett hesitated again, then said, Your father was also planning to meet with a private investigator. He wanted to dig deeper into Julia's past, but he died before he could follow through. I can give you the investigator's contact information if you think it might help. Emily's pulse quickened. I'll take it. Back at the house, Emily tried to avoid Julia and Ryan. She didn't trust either of them, especially after Ryan's cryptic warning in the attic. Instead, she retreated to the guest room and called the investigator, a gruff man named Victor Hayes. I remember your father, Hayes said over the phone. He hired me to look into some suspicious activity involving his wife, Julia Parker. He believed she was siphoning money from his business accounts into a private offshore fund. Emily's breath hitched. Did you find anything? Plenty, Hayes replied. But before I could give him the full report, he passed away. I still have the files, though. If you want to see them, you'll need to meet me in person. Emily arranged to meet Hayes that afternoon at a coffee shop on the edge of town. When she arrived, the investigator handed her a manila folder. Inside were bank statements, transaction logs, and photographs of Julia meeting with an unknown man outside a luxury hotel. Emily's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. This is damning, she said. Hayes nodded. Your father was building a case to confront her. He believed she was planning to leave him and take as much as she could. Emily's mind raced. If her father had been preparing for a confrontation, had Julia acted to protect herself? Could she have been involved in more than just the missing will? That evening, Emily returned to the house, her hands shaking as she clutched the folder. She found Ryan in the living room, pacing. We need to talk, she said. Ryan stopped and looked at her, his expression wary. What now? Emily held up the folder. I know about Julia. The missing money, the lies. She was stealing from Dad. Ryan's face darkened. Where did you get that? From the investigator Dad hired. He was building a case against her before he died, Emily said. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his tension palpable. You don't know what you're getting into, Emily. Then tell me, she pressed. Ryan hesitated, then said, Dad found out about Julia's affair a few months before he died. He told me he was changing the will to cut her out completely, but he didn't want anyone to know until it was finalized. I didn't believe him at first, but now, he gestured to the folder. Now I think Julia found out and acted before he could follow through. Emily's stomach dropped. You think she? Ryan nodded grimly. I don't want to believe it either, but Dad's death wasn't natural. He was healthy, active, and now the will is gone. It's too much to be a coincidence. Emily stared at her brother, the weight of his words sinking in. If what he said was true, then Julia had far more to answer for than they'd realized. Emily and Ryan spent the rest of the night combing through the folder, piecing together Julia's deceit. Every bank statement, photograph, and transaction log painted a damning picture. The affair, the siphoned money, the timing of their father's death. It all pointed to something far darker than they had imagined. We can't keep this to ourselves, Ryan said, his voice hushed but firm. We need to take this to Mr. Garrett. And the police. Emily nodded, but a part of her hesitated. We don't have proof that Julia had anything to do with Dad's death. All we have is speculation. Ryan's jaw tightened. Speculation or not, we can't let her get away with this. We'll confront her first. See how she reacts. Emily wasn't sure it was a good idea, but Ryan was already marching toward the door. Julia was in the kitchen, a glass of red wine in hand, when they found her. She looked up, startled, as Ryan stormed in with Emily close behind. "What's going on?" Julia asked, her voice sharp. Ryan slammed the folder onto the table. "Care to explain this?" Julia's face paled as she glanced at the papers spilling out of the folder. Her hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "What is this?" "You know exactly what it is," Ryan said. "We know about the stolen money, the affair, everything. Dad knew too. That's why he was changing the will, wasn't it?" Julia's lips parted in shock, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is ridiculous. You're accusing me of what, exactly?" Emily stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're accusing you of lying to Dad, stealing from him, and possibly having something to do with his death. And let's not forget the missing will." Julia's expression hardened. "You've lost your minds. I had nothing to do with Richard's death. He died of a heart attack. For God's sake. Ask the doctor." "Convenient, isn't it?" Ryan shot back. "A perfectly timed heart attack, just as he was about to cut you out of his life and his will." Julia's gaze flickered, but she didn't respond. Emily pressed on. "And the missing will? How do you explain that? You were the one closest to him. You had access to everything." Julia's grip on the wine glass tightened until Emily thought it might shatter. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she snapped. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but you're just grasping at straws. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to smear me." Emily and Ryan exchanged a glance. Julia was deflecting, but there was a crack in her armor. Ryan leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "We're taking this to the police. Let them decide if we're grasping at straws." For the first time, true panic flickered across Julia's face. "You wouldn't dare," she said, her voice trembling. "Watch us," Emily said. That night, as they prepared to leave for the lawyer's office with the evidence, the house fell into an uneasy silence. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows flickered in the dimly lit hallway as she carried the folder to her room. As she turned the corner, Julia appeared out of nowhere, blocking her path. "Emily," Julia said, her voice icy. "We need to talk." Emily tensed. "I don't think we have anything left to say." Julia's eyes darkened. "Oh, but we do. You think you're so clever, digging through Richard's things. But you don't know the whole story." Emily swallowed hard. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Julia leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father wasn't the saint you think he was. He had secrets too. Secrets that would destroy this family if they ever came to light." Emily's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" Julia smirked, but there was a venomous edge to her expression. "Ask your brother. I'm sure he knows more than he's letting on." Emily's blood ran cold. What did Julia mean? Could Ryan be hiding something? Julia stepped back, her smirk fading into a cold glare. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emily. Be careful. You might not like what you find." As Julia disappeared down the hall, Emily stood frozen, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. Doubt crept into her mind. Was Julia bluffing? Or was there another layer to this twisted family drama that she had yet to uncover? Emily barely slept, Julia's ominous words echoing in her mind. By morning, she resolved to confront Ryan. Whatever secrets were buried in their family, it was time for the truth to come out. She found Ryan in the living room, staring blankly at the fireplace. The folder of evidence sat on the coffee table between them, untouched since last night. "Ryan," Emily began, her voice steady. "We need to talk." He looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "About Julia?" "No," Emily said, sitting across from him. "About what she said last night. She told me you know more than you're letting on." Ryan's face tightened, his hands curling into fists. For a long moment, he said nothing. "Ryan," Emily pressed, her voice softening. "If there's something I need to know, you have to tell me. Please." He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "It's true. I've been hiding something, but it's not what you think." Emily waited, her heart pounding. Dad told me about Julia's affair months ago, Ryan admitted. But it wasn't just the affair. He said she was blackmailing him. Emily's eyes widened. Blackmailing him? With what? Ryan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Before Dad married Julia, he borrowed a large sum of money to keep the family business afloat. He always said it came from an investor, but it didn't. It came from Julia, and she had the paperwork to prove it. Emily's stomach sank. So, she was using that to control him? Ryan nodded. He told me he wanted to pay her off, but the money wasn't enough. She threatened to go public, to ruin his reputation, and he didn't want you to know. He thought you'd hate him for it. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I could fix it, Ryan said, his voice breaking. I thought if I found the will and kept her from getting everything, I could make it right. Emily froze. Wait, you've seen the will? Ryan nodded slowly. I found it in Dad's office the night he died. But when I read it, I panicked. He didn't cut Julia out completely. He left her a share of the estate. I was so angry that I burned it. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You what? I didn't think it would matter, Ryan said, his voice desperate. I thought the draft would be enough, but now it's all falling apart. Emily buried her face in her hands, trying to process what she just heard. The will was gone. Their father's secrets were exposed, and Julia still held all the power. We need to end this, Emily said finally. No more lies, no more hiding. We're taking the evidence to Mr. Garrett and the police. Let them sort it out. Ryan nodded reluctantly, and together, they gathered the folder and drove to the lawyer's office. When they arrived, Mr. Garrett listened carefully as they laid everything out. The missing will, Julia's blackmail, and the burned document. He sighed heavily when they finished. This is a mess, he admitted. But the evidence you've provided about Julia's financial dealings is significant. I'll contact the authorities and ensure this is handled properly. As they left the office, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over, but the truth was finally out. Back at the house, Julia was waiting for them. She stood in the foyer, her arms crossed, her expression cold and calculating. You've been busy, she said. We know everything, Julia, Emily said, her voice firm. About the blackmail, the money, all of it. We've handed it over to the lawyer and the police. Julia's face twisted with fury. You think you've won? You're just as pathetic as your father was. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady. No, Julia, we're finally free of you. For a moment, Julia looked like she might lash out, but instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house. Months later, Julia was charged with financial fraud and blackmail after the evidence came to light. The estate was settled in court, with Emily and Ryan receiving equal shares. As for the Parker family, the scars from the ordeal remained, but Emily and Ryan began to rebuild their lives, determined to honor their father's legacy. Standing in the empty Parker house one last time, Emily looked around, a bittersweet smile on her face. We made it, she said softly. Ryan nodded. Dad would have been proud. Together, they walked out of the house, leaving the ghosts of the past behind.